Hey guys, how is everyone? This is pretty cool. Sergio's first ever major win. This is huge news for him. In 73 attempts, I believe it was, he finally pulled it off. And so I'm pretty excited to be able to go through his swing and talk to you guys about one of the things I get asked all the time, and that is, what pros on tour most resemble the Rotary Swing Tour move? And my answer is always the same. They all do, to some degree or another. They have to use the RST fundamentals. Where people tend to kind of get hung up on details is what the swing looks like in terms of the backswing and even in the downswing a little bit. But that stuff's happening so quick that to the naked eye, unless you're studying it with slow motion video, you can't really tell. But the backswing's happening slow enough, and people kind of take a look at the backswing and say, oh, well, that's a rotary swing or that isn't. And really, it's not really the most important part of the swing. And I'm going to talk about what that means and what it is that you need to look at in Tour Pro swings that you can take out of that are following RST fundamentals, because the simple reality is the RST fundamentals are based on science, right? They're based on your anatomy, they're based on biomechanics, they're based on the physics of the swing. And so my answer is all Tour Pros use the RST fundamentals or they wouldn't be Tour Pros. That's what the difference is. The fundamentals apply to everyone because by definition, they are fundamentals. We don't deal into the gray area and little goofy tricks here and there to try and fix ball flight issues. We talk about what the real fundamentals are. And with Sergio, believe it or not, he is still following the RSC fundamentals. Now, there's a lot of things that he's making more difficult for himself that are difficult moves that can lead to all kinds of issues, which I'm going to talk about first here. And the first one I'm going to talk about is his axis tilt at setup. Now, you hear me harp about axis tilt all the time, and even though Sergio roughly has some here, it's not the amount that we would typically advocate. As you can see here, even with an iron, I have more axis tilt. Typically with the driver, you tend to see a little bit more axis tilt at address. Note he's got a little bit of forward shaft lean with the driver here, and so he looks kind of like he's kind of loaded up a little bit more to the left, whereas I look a little bit more loaded up to the right. These are small amounts of difference, but they start to add up really big in the backswing. So this would be something where I would say this isn't necessarily ideal, and it's going to lead to several other things that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But let's get moving here first. One big thing I want to talk about, we'll draw a line on the side of both of our heads here, and let's take a look at what happens as we go back during the backswing. So one thing you'll notice is that Sergio kind of tilts his head, but even though he's kind of starting to reverse pivot here a little bit, his head's still moving away from the target. Now, most amateurs at this point, the huge problem that we see all the time is the reverse pivot where their head is actually moving in front of the line where it started and just gets worse and worse as they start down. Sergio's head, even though it started a little bit forward, almost right on the edge of the back of the ball, which is a bit forward for a driver to create a positive or shallow angle of attack, which he does not have, which we'll talk about again in a second. Sergio's head actually moves away from the ball a little bit, so he's starting to recover and get into a little bit of a better position, but he's not quite there yet. And then I'm going to draw you another line here, which represents, let me grab the line here, he's almost starting to kind of lean toward the target. And it looks like it's more so than it is because he's made a huge shoulder turn. So you see a lot of shoulder behind his head, which makes him look like he's leaning really hard toward the target, which again is a really big problem in amateur golf where we get this reverse pivot versus if we take my swing to the top, you'll notice my head has also moved slightly off the ball, not quite as much because I already started up in a better position. But at the top of my swing, it looks like I'm more decidedly leaned away from the target versus Sergio. You'll notice his right knee is starting to kind of bow out. He's pushing into the outside of his right foot, starting to roll over here. He's had a little bit of a minor hip slide that's caused his upper body to look like it's leaning toward the target. And this is definitely not a rotary swing fundamental. Why is this so important? Well, because your spine angle is going to dictate swing plane. But now we both know that Sergio doesn't swing over the top coming down like so many amateurs do and would from this position. So how on earth does he keep from swinging over the top with this really steep spine angle leaned toward the target versus having a little bit more shallower spine where the spine is leaned away from the target makes it much easier for me to come down from the inside. And this is how we want to look at the top of the rotary swing, because it just makes things so much simpler to shallow out the swing plane. Now I'm going to draw one more line here. We'll put a line here at the side of Sergio's head at the top. And this is where things are going to separate the pros from everybody else. And that is, notice how his head actually starts to move back away from the line where he was at the top. So he's nowhere near where he started at the top of his, or excuse me, at setup. And now he's even moving further away as he starts down. Now most amateurs do the exact opposite, and that is they push from the right side of their body, their right arm, their right shoulder, and they start moving further in front of the ball, or in front of the line where they started at address. All tour pros will have to get back behind the ball at impact, or they won't have any power, because when you go to release the club, that's where your release comes from. If you release and your body's out in front of it, the release happens what we call late, and so you lose a ton of club head speed. So your head has got to be behind that ball at impact, and Sergio just happens to do it at a really different time. This is a really tricky move that you're not going to try and teach a bunch of amateur golfers, and there's no need to, because it's much more efficient to do it the way that I'm showing you here, which is to start with some axis tilt at address, move back behind a little bit. Most tour pros will do this where their head starts to move just a hair in front of it at impact as they start down, but then as you get back in impact, it's right back where it started. So rather than having my head move 6 inches all over the place back and forth, which is pretty tricky to try and teach somebody how to do that and to time all of that, and is unnecessary wasted movement, I simply kind of start in a better position, move back a little bit, move forward a little bit, and then everything's much, much simpler. And that's really the goal of rotary swing, is to make the movements as simple and minimal as humanly possible. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Now, Sergio makes a great recovery from basically a reverse pivoted position. It's not a severe reverse pivot like we see all the time in amateur golfers, but effectively his spine is leaning roughly a little bit toward the target, and definitely too much for a driver. And so what this tends to lead to is a really steep angle of attack, and that is Sergio's kind of misery that he has to deal with here. Even though he's a great ball striker and a great driver of the ball, he's also one of the most inefficient drivers of the ball on the PGA Tour. Now, how do we know this? Well, we can look at the stats. If you look at his TrackMan stats, he was ranked 180th out of 185 last year in launch angle off the tee. And launch angle, especially for amateur golfers who don't have 120 plus mile an hour club head speed like Sergio does, is critical for optimizing distance, because most every single amateur on the planet needs more distance off the tee, and you can't get it with a driver hitting down on it sharply with the driver, because the ball simply doesn't have enough time in the air to carry very far. So Sergio can afford to average, I think he averaged, 7.76 degree launch angle last year in 2016. Now this year for 2017, he's moved up the rankings from 180th to 138th and is launching an average of 10.5 degrees. So even he has changed his launch angle 3 degrees this year, which is a huge, huge change, which gives him a much higher ball flight, which is critical and could even be, possibly, I'm not saying this for sure, but part of the reason he was able to win the Masters this year is because at Augusta, the landing areas are so small for shots into the greens that you need to hit the ball very high so that it can stop very quickly, especially with the longer clubs. When you're launching it at 7.5, 7.75 degrees with the driver, it's going to roll a little bit. Augusta's not that difficult off the tee, but when you're hitting a 3-iron into a green and you're hitting down on it that sharply, the ball is simply going to have a really hard time holding because it's just flying too low. So this part of the swing is absolutely critical. And again, it comes back to axis tilt. Ideally, for an amateur, we want to have that axis tilt at setup where you are leaned away from the target slightly, and then as you get into impact, you're leaned further away. You notice now I have more axis tilt than I had at address. The first yellow line here is where I was at address. Now this is where I am at impact because my hips have moved further forward at impact, which causes my spine to lean back further and allows me to create a shallow angle of attack, which is critical for distance off the tee. So Sergio starts with his head way far forward, moves back a little bit, and by the time he gets back to impact, he's way back behind the ball. Now you can imagine that as you're trying to learn the golf swing and try to become a better ball striker, that your head moving in these 3 different stages is probably not going to be the easiest thing in the world for you to learn. And again, completely unnecessary to change all these angles. Notice now where his spine angle is. Completely different positions. These are very dynamic things that he's achieving in his swing that are completely extra movements that you don't need to bother with. So axis tilted setup, huge. Now, one thing that Sergio does extremely well is that, right? He has a ton of lag in his downswing. For those of you who don't understand, this lag is a confusing term for a lot of people, and it's a bit misleading in some ways, but basically, if you look at the angle between the forearm and the shaft, how far the club head is lagging behind the hands is a simple way to define it and understand it. But the reason that this is important is because about 2/3 of your club head speed comes from the release of this wrist angle. So without this wrist angle, which most amateurs don't look anything like this, they look more like this at this stage. That club's way out over here, and they start throwing lag away. Because this is about 2/3 of your club head speed just from the release of this wrist angle, I always tell people in the clinics that your job, your thesis statement, your job description for your golf swing, if you've never thought about it this way, is 3 things. You have 3 primary tasks. You have to create, maintain, and release lag. Now, most people try to create lag just by setting their wrist really early in the backswing. Sergio is a great example of an exaggerated move with RST where we talk about we don't want to set our wrist very aggressively during the backswing because it really activates the forearm muscles, the extensor muscles in the forearm, which makes them want to release too early in the downswing. So a rotary swing fundamental in the backswing is to set your wrists very late and really set them mostly during the downswing. Sergio personifies that to the nth degree and then exaggerates it quite a bit. He really doesn't have much wrist set at all here. But now as he starts down and starts to pull down with that left arm and his right wrist is relaxed, that allows this wrist angle to be created that is now doing the second part of his job description, allowing him to maintain lag late into the downswing. And that is the key. It doesn't do you any good to have a lot of lag at the top of your backswing unless you can maintain it late in the downswing. And so if we continue to move forward, notice right before impact, Sergio's still got almost a 90-degree angle between his right forearm and the club shaft. And the club head now, at this point, needs to be releasing because that lag doesn't do us any good unless we get rid of it. And so Sergio's creating lag. He's maintaining it by setting his wrist during the downswing by having soft wrists and using the pulling motion of the left arm rather than the pushing from the right wrist, which causes you to do the exact opposite. That causes you to release lag, which is the opposite of your job description. Your job is to create, maintain, and release lag, not to create lag really early and then throw it away right from the top of the swing. So we want to create, maintain late in the downswing, and now we need to get rid of it. That doesn't do us any good to hold on to it any longer. So Sergio does a great job, like every other tour pro, following the RST fundamentals of letting those wrists turn over. How do we know that? Well, into the release point, notice how I can see the knuckles on his hand here. The right hand's completely crossed over the left. His head has stayed way back behind the ball. In fact, it's moved back even further. We can put yet another line on here than it was at impact. So his head is moved back almost a foot from where it was, and this allows him to stay behind the ball to release the club head fully. Most amateurs do the exact opposite of almost all of this. They set their wrist very early in the backswing, they throw it from the top, they reverse pivot, and then they push from the right side of their body, and that causes them to throw the club because you're creating too much force too early in the downswing. You can't maintain that lag, so you're losing the purpose of your job, which is, to create, maintain, and release lag. Now, all of this movement is pretty tricky to try and master. Again, we can make it much, much simpler if we just focus on doing the RST fundamentals, which are covered in the website, right? So my swing doesn't have all these extra movements in it, and I don't have a ton of crazy lag because you don't need that much lag, because typically the byproduct of having that much lag in the swing is that it's difficult to get rid of in time. And so if my head wasn't way back here, I'd have a really hard time getting rid of all of that lag. And because I don't want my head trying to move all over the place in the backswing and the downswing, I don't try and maintain that much lag. I can have a moderate amount of lag and still have the same effect, the same amount of power, but without having to try and have my head move all over the place. So Sergio's swing, he has a ton of great RST fundamentals in it. He releases the club. You'll notice, we'll go back a couple frames here. Too many frames. That, you see my forearms are fully crossed over here because, again, my job description states that I need to release that lag, which means my forearms must cross over. It's a little blurry there, but you can see the same thing. You can see the knuckles on my hands here, on my golf club, that my hands are released, my head has stayed back, my chest has stayed back, and again, most amateurs do the opposite. So now I'm going to walk you through this stuff a little bit more in detail, showing you exactly what Sergio is doing and what typical amateurs do and how to fix it.